Professor Timothy Jackson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So today we're doing a twofold exercise. Not only is this an interview with you, but this is also a right of reply. We're invoking the ancient ritual of right of reply, which is where if an individual is mentioned or their work is brought up and the person is not there, that person is allowed an opportunity to respond to whatever the mention was in order to add additional context. So if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself for people who don't know you. I know you're a very accomplished music theorist in your field, but for people who are not a part of that world, if you could give us your background, who you are, why you are famous, and then we'll get into some of the controversy afterwards.
Well, I started when I was 6 years old, being interested in music. I always wanted to be a composer when I was a little boy, and I never heard of music theory. I didn't know what music theory was, but I knew what composition was. And I love to improvise at the piano. Um, and I read about all the great composers. I read their biographies for kids, the kids version. And I became really interested in being a composer from that point on. And so I started playing the piano. And when I was 11, no, actually, when I was 9, no, when I was 11, I'm sorry. When I was 11, I went to Juilliard for a year in the um, preparatory division as a pianist, and I got a full scholarship to do that. So I wasn't bad as a pianist, actually. Um, and then during high school, I continued my piano studies right up to the end of high school, but I applied for composition in university, and I went to McGill University in Montreal, Canada, because I grew up in Canada, actually. Um, my stints at Juilliard were made possible because my father was a professor of architecture and he got a sabbatical in New York, and I was able to study at Juilliard while he was doing his research. So I continued my studies, and I also attended the Royal Conservatory in Toronto for a while. And then when I applied for university, as I mentioned, I applied as a composition student, and I was accepted to McGill University's composition program. That was in the late 70s. Um, and I graduated in 1980, 79, 80. And then I spent a year in Toronto studying at the University of Toronto. And there I encountered an amazing guy by the name of Edward Laufer, who was one of the most distinguished Schenkerians in the world. He was very, very influential, and he's the person that really convinced me that Schenkerian analysis is very, very important. I ended up being an informal student of Ed Laufer for 35 years. And that really influenced my way of thinking about music. And then I couldn't stay at Toronto to continue my studies with him because he wasn't authorized to teach grad students at that time. The problem was that he hadn't finished his own doctorate at Princeton. And so the bureaucrats determined that he wasn't able to teach grad students, which was, of course, nonsense. But I couldn't stay, so he wrote me a letter of recommendation, and I applied to go to Queens College of the City University of New York, and I went there and I studied with another well-known Schenkerian by the name of Karl Schachter, and followed him around for 7 years and wrote my dissertation under him, and graduated from the program in New York at the Graduate Center in music, which was a very good program at that time. It was probably one of the top programs in the US. I think it was ranked third at the time. I should mention that while I was working on my doctorate, I became very interested in the music of Richard Strauss. And so I applied for a year of research study in Germany. And in 1986, I went to Germany to work on my research for my doctoral dissertation on Strauss, which enabled me to work in his house. I met his daughter-in-law and her dog, who was a huge dog. And I spent many happy hours poking around his office and looking at his sketches for his major works. I also spent a year in Munich and studied at the University of Munich, which was interesting. Actually, my main focus was the Academy of Arts in Munich, because my teacher there was a man by the name of Horst Leuchtmann, who was the editor of the complete works of Lassus, a Renaissance composer. And I got to know him pretty well, actually, which was very, very interesting. And then I graduated with my doctorate in 1988. I went back to Europe and I spent a year in Austria as a postdoctoral fellow in Vienna, working on Bruckner's manuscripts, but also looking at every other manuscript by every other interesting composer I could get my hands on. And I also traveled extensively around Europe at that time and spent some time even in Eastern Europe before the wall came down. I looked at manuscripts in Poland, for example, in Krakow. And then after some various publications started to appear under my name, I got my first position, and for 6 years I taught at Connecticut College in New London at a small private arts college and had a few interesting music students. And then I ended up leaving that position and I went to the University of North Texas in 1998. And I've been at North Texas since that time. So I've been teaching here about 28 years now. Um, and I should mention along the way, while I was still at Connecticut College, I won a Fulbright to teach in Germany for a year. And I taught a course on Schenkerian analysis in Germany at the University of Erlangen, which is near Nuremberg. It's sort of like a suburb of Nuremberg, if you will. So I actually was both a student and a professor in Germany for a year each time. So I have quite a bit of a background in Germany and German culture and in Austrian culture, which reflects my deep interest not only in music history but also in Jewish history in those German-speaking realms of Europe. And then when I came back here and I got my job at UNT, I taught not only music courses, but we used to have a very vibrant and dynamic program called the Jewish and Israel Studies program. And I taught two courses in the music school related to that program. One was called Jews in Opera, and the other one was called Nazism, Judaism, and the Politics of Classical Music. At a certain point along the way, I became a distinguished research professor, of which there are maybe 15, I think, in the whole university. And that was based on my scholarship, list of publications, and recommendations, outside recommendations, and so forth. I also, along the way, I started a Center for Schenkerian Studies. Actually, in 2000, I started that. And as part of that effort, I started a journal called the Journal of Schenkerian Studies, which existed up until 2020, and which I think was quite a contribution to Schenkerian analysis and Schenkerian studies. I directed a center which also made recordings this might interest people who are practical musicians. And one of the CDs that I helped to produce actually won a Grammy nomination. Um, I teach I teach a variety of courses at the College of Music. I mean, I teach the common core courses, but I also teach a course which I designed and which I initiated called Analysis and Performance, which combines really Schenkerian approach to analysis with discussion of performance, how analysis can influence performance, and vice versa, how performance can influence analysis. And that seems to have been well received by a large number of students, mostly DMA students. So not music theory specifically, although some music theorists have taken that course, but it's populated mainly by practical musicians. Um, and as a result of teaching that course, in part, I've graduated at least maybe 10 or 15 people who've worked, not 15, 10, I would say, 10 students who've earned their DMA degrees, but worked very closely with me on analysis. So I've served as the co-major professor along with their instrumental professor for their doctoral dissertations. And I'm very proud of the work that I've done with these students over the years because it shows, I think, that music theory can be a very organic part of performance and training in performance. That it's not a separate field, but something that can be integrated with the whole study of music, both from a performance and from let's say, a theoretical approach or background. So that's really a nutshell. That's really a kind of thumbnail view of what I've done over my career at UNT.
Would you mind speaking about your Jewish background? Because I think that's important for the framing of not only this conversation, but because it's an integral part of your background and it has played a role in your research.
Right. So to answer that question, again, there are many different parts of it, but my grandmother on my mother's side came from a small town called Pszenice in Poland. She came to America at the age of 19 by herself, and she left 6 older brothers and her parents back in this small town in Poland, which is about 100 miles southwest of the town of Łódź in Poland, or Lodz, and it's pronounced Lodz in German, or Łódź in Polish. And my great grandfather, his name was Littman Blumstein, he had a coal business there. And obviously he wanted a girl because he kept having boys. And my grandma was the last to be born, and she was finally the girl. So she must have been the apple of their eyes. But she saved up her money, every cent that she could possibly make. I don't know how she did it, but she did it. And she told me that she just could not stand the anti-Semitism in Poland. It was just too much. She would be walking down the street and some guy would spit on her or would push her into the gutter and say, "Get out of my way, you dirty Jew." And this affected her profoundly to the point that she decided to give up everything, basically, her entire family. She said goodbye to her parents and she never saw them again. And all of her brothers, except for 2, she never saw them again. And she got a ticket. Well, first she went to the American Embassy in Warsaw and got her papers, and then she got on the train and went to Bremerhaven in northern Germany and got on the boat. And this was 1924. So she was extremely lucky because that year was the year when the American government influenced by anti-Semitic considerations, decided not to allow very many Jews to emigrate anymore. So my grandma was in the last batch, you might say. She was the last of the lucky few at that time to get out. And she came to New York, and I have her immigration entry card copy. And she got on the train and she went to Detroit in America. And I don't know why exactly she went to Detroit. She may well have known a few people there. But anyway, she settled in Detroit. She was always very, very poor. The person that she married, my grandfather, was uh, not not a wealthy guy. He was quite a bit older than her. He was a peddler basically, and not well off. And unfortunately, he died when my mother was 17 years old. So I never got to meet my grandfather on that side. His name was Sherman, and he was an interesting person, though, apparently. Anyway, my mother grew up there, so she was the daughter of immigrants. I got to know my grandma quite well, actually, because she visited us periodically. And she told me a lot of stories. And she spoke German, Russian, Polish, and Yiddish. And English, she wrote phonetically. She never went to school here, so she never learned how to spell. And she always sounded like even though she came here when she was 19, she always sounded like she just got off the boat. She never lost her very heavy Polish accent. So she was always marked as an immigrant, I'm afraid. And she loved music. She loved classical music, but she didn't understand it. Um, and my mother told me that they were very poor, and sometimes there wasn't enough food to eat. But my grandma made sure that my mother took violin lessons. There was always, even if they were starving, there was always food. There was maybe not enough food, but there was always money for violin lessons. And so my mother grew up playing the violin, even though she was not really gifted as a musician. But she loved music too. My mother also loved music. And so my grandma said to me when I was very little, she said, "You know, Tim, I didn't have a chance to do much with my life because I came here and I basically gave up everything to do it. But you, Tim, you are going to fulfill my dream. You are going to get yourself a proper education. And if you love music, you're going to be a musician." And that encouragement was absolutely fundamental to me. Every time there was a Jewish holiday or I had a birthday, my grandma would send me money. I knew that she was poor, but she always put a $50 bill or a $100 bill, or she would put, she liked to buy me Israel bonds, so she would put those in the envelope with the card. And I was, of course, a little boy who wanted to spend the money on toys, but my mother and father said, "No, no, 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 your grandma doesn't want that. She wants you to put this in the bank and save it up for when you need it to go to school, to university." So as a young boy, this really was quite a powerful message. Um, and I should mention my father's parents, who I also knew pretty well, actually, even better than my mother's mother. Um, So my father's parents were, I mean, it's a long story, but my father came from a similar background, but um, his parents, my grandfather on my father's side came from a town called Mogilev, which is in White Russia. Today it's called Belarus. He came from this town. My great grandfather was what was called a privileged Jew. And the reason he was privileged was because he was a master carpenter who made very fancy furniture, which is a skill. And he taught my grandfather the same skill. It was like father to son handed down. Jews were not allowed to live in the cities, generally speaking, in this part of Russia. But because my great-grandfather had these skills, because he was a master craftsman, he had special permission, and he had a store and a business in Mogilev. The problem with my great-grandfather was that he was too close to the wealthy ruling class, and so he was murdered in a pogrom. And my great-grandmother brought my grandfather and his sister, his younger sister, to England around 1917, so around the time of the revolution or the beginning of the revolution in Russia. My grandfather tried to follow in the footsteps of his father and be a master craftsman. And in fact, he always had that skill, and he made all the furniture in my grandparents' house. So when I stayed with my grandparents in England, I would always, be on their furniture. And it really struck me that my grandfather was this amazing, he had this amazing facility with his hands, like incredible. Um, but anyway, just to cut a long story short, my grandfather came to England in 1917. And although England was not nearly as bad, let's say, in terms of anti-Semitism as Russia or Poland, it still wasn't friendly in many ways to Jews. And my grandfather's last name was Zelichin, and his name was Jack or Yakov Zelichin. And so he changed his name from Jack Zelichin to Jack Jackson in 1936. My father was 11 years old at the time, and he had four older brothers, um, two of whom were my grandfather's children. I won't go into all the details, but um, my grandfather really wanted his sons to have a chance, and he felt that even in England, which was much more opening and welcoming to Jews, it still was problematic to be clearly identified as a Jew. So he changed his name, and especially because my father was considered the bright one in the family. My father had some amazing abilities. He was very good at mathematics. He was a sharp-edged sword in terms of his intellect, and he was the only boy in the family who made it to go to pre-university training in England. So my grandfather was very concerned that my father have an opportunity to go to a higher education in England, and that's why he changed the name at that particular juncture. So my father went to bed one night as a Zelichin, and the next day he woke up 11 years old as a Jackson. And that I have all the documentation of all that, the name change and everything. It's quite amazing. Um, and so my father did end up going going to university, or the equivalent of university in England. He went to the London Polytechnic, which was a technical engineering and architecture school, and he ended up becoming a professor. Um, and my parents emigrated to Canada along the way after my father had served in the British Army, and all his brothers were in the British Army during World War II. My parents emigrated to Canada to get a new start, and my father became a professor of architecture in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and that's where I grew up. But we periodically would visit my grandparents. And I should mention that my grandparents on my father's side also loved music, and they very much encouraged me to become a composer. And my grandparents agreed, all of them, that when I turned 13, which is a big year in Jewish boys' lives, they would buy me a grand piano. And my grandparents sat down and agreed on how many keys each would pay for. So my father's parents paid for a certain number. My mother's mother paid for a certain number, and my parents ended up paying for all the rest of the keys. And so I still have my piano downstairs in my house here that they bought me at that time. It was a good one. And, you know, it was a lot of money for that time. It was a huge amount of money. And represented a real commitment to me becoming a musician. Um, I should also mention that my parents are distantly related through marriage. The two, that's how they met, actually. Even though the families were scattered, like my mother's family was in America and my father's was in England, but they had somewhere along the line they had the two families had a marriage, and that's how my mother met my father, was because she wrote to him in England because she was going to study in France, and she came through England and she met my father, and the rest was history. But she did in fact go on to work and study in France for a while. She was an artist of some stature, actually. Um, and she was also very, very influenced by the Holocaust, I would say, as were my grandparents, especially my mother's mother. Because what happened was that her entire family, which she had left in Europe, was murdered in the Holocaust. So after the war, my grandmother went from Detroit back to Europe, back to France, actually, where three of her brothers had lived, and then to Poland looking for her family and not finding anyone left except for one brother. One of her brothers survived. So my parents, of course, generation was absolutely devastated by this, by the Holocaust. And one thing I should mention also is that my mother was a very devoted artist. Like it really was her métier. And she's a very interesting artist. And she had works and has works in major collections around the world. And there's a Wikipedia article about her and so on. When I was 3 years old, so this was around 1960, my mother took in a little girl who was my own age. She was also probably around 3, 4, 5. And so I had an adopted sister for a while, which seemed kind of strange to me, I have to say. And I didn't understand this until much, much later. But it turned out that this little girl, her mother, had been subjected to experiments in the concentration camps.
Wow.
And the mother was not well mentally and physically as a result. And so my parents adopted this little girl for a while. I can't remember how long, but she appears in pictures and little movies that my parents took of my early birthday parties. And so my mother, who was very busy, nevertheless took in another 3-year-old, a 3-year-old of a woman who actually could barely walk because they had amputated part of her bone in her leg, and who was very, very distraught because of her experiences as a prisoner in the concentration camps, who had been experimented on. And so this is the kind of connection that my parents had with my grandparents' generation and with the experience of the war and the Holocaust. And I should mention also that children of the brothers of my grandma were in France during the war, and two of the children actually survived. The rest were deported and murdered. But two of them survived, and one of them I knew pretty well, and my mother was very friendly with. And she lived in Paris. I visited her over the years sometimes. So did my sister. And she was younger than my father during the war. She was a child, and she was hidden for at least, I think, 2.5 years in a barn. She was kept in this barn. She could not, with her parents, she could not come out for 2 years. She lived in the dark. Very often she was hungry, but they were saved by a neighbor from across the street in Paris. This woman had a country house with a barn, and somehow she managed to get enough food rations to keep them alive and hidden in the sort of the underground part of this barn for 2.5 years. Now her father went stir crazy, and one day he went out. He couldn't take it anymore, and he was caught and sent to Auschwitz. But she and her mother survived. So my parents were friendly with her name is Regine, and she they had a living connection with people who had survived the Holocaust, who were related to them. The very, very few who survived this. The rest of my relatives who perished in the Holocaust were either sent to Auschwitz, where they were gassed, or the ones who lived in Papshenica were murdered, and their bodies were thrown into a pit. And now there's a small memorial where they were interred. So it's quite it's a very traumatic story. And actually, my mother, as an artist, has done some paintings about these things, which are very, very striking, and which I think I should get exhibited somewhere. Um, anyway, that's my background. Now, I should mention also along the way that my parents were not Orthodox. They were not religious Jews, but and my family was not Orthodox for over a century. So even back in Europe, they weren't Orthodox Jews. Although in the 19th century, I have pictures of my father's ancestors going back to Warsaw in the 19th century. Yes, they were kind of religious, traditionally religious. They weren't Hasidic or anything like that. But I decided when I was 20 to go to Israel and try to find out more about being Jewish. So I went there and I studied at a yeshiva for a while and tried to pick up something of a Jewish education. So I can sort of read Hebrew and Aramaic, and I have a Jewish education, which I'm not as proud of as I should be, but I do have some background in Jewish education as well. So that's sort of where I'm coming from.
Hmm. Well, for
It's a
people
long and
listening,
intricate story.
well, but the fact that you know your family history like that, I think, is very important. Most people don't have a connection from where they've come from. In America, we have
Right.
this sort of radical individualism. I am my own person, and
Right.
while that is true to an extent, we are also the products of our environments. We're the products of our families, and that means something. So,
Okay.
if nothing else, I hope people take away the importance of why having a tie to your ancestry, so to speak, is so important. Now, I do want to pivot to the controversy,
Uh-huh.
and with so I gauge on how something important is based on if my parents hear about it. My parents are not musicians; they have no connection to the music world. And while I was at UNT during your the initial spark of this controversy, I got a text from my mother saying, "Hey, do you know anything about this?" She had received or she had found an article someone was starting to write on you, and that was my first experience with discovering what was happening at UNT. So, if you
Uh,
wouldn't mind, uh, and I'm going to try and set the stage, and then you correct me, and then you take it from there. But Dr. Philip Ewell, who is a music theorist whom I've had on this podcast before, music theorist and race scholar, had given, I think it was a 9 minute, the way he had described it, it was a 9 minute lecture on Schenker. and some of the problems that he perceived from Schenkerian fanatics and Schenkerian analysis. I think that was where we had started that conversation. And there were several responses that were written, one of which was yours, but several responses that were written by Schenkerian theorists that blew up. And yours in particular, I think, was the most controversial and the one that most people took issue with. One of the criticisms that Dr. Ewell had levied at the symposium, I suppose, of Schenkerian theorists who had gotten together
It
was that
wasn't
he.
just Schenkerians, though. It wasn't.
Mm,
So it was anybody who wanted to weigh in. So we didn't have just Schenkerians responding. I just grabbed that. So
sure, of course. One of the criticisms that he had levied was that he was not invited to take part in a response.
hmm.
And I believe in the podcast he had said, uh, and if I'm misquoting, then forgive me, Dr. Ewell, but I think he had said he believed it was because he was black and that there was an inherent racial bias, in part because not everyone who studies Schenkerian analysis, but in part because Schenker, he had accused of being a racist, of loving Hitler or being fond of Hitler, of not liking women, not liking minorities, and particularly not liking people who were black. And I know a lot of students responded to your work with an incredible amount of vitriol. It should also be noted that was this back in 2020?
Hmm.
Yes, so there was a lot of cultural events happening outside of what was happening in the music theory world that I think probably set the perfect storm for this sort of thing to bubble up. Because I think when most people hear about a music theory controversy, that sounds so bizarre. What is it's like the Kardashians of the music theory world. What is happening that has gained so much attention from people who are not musicians? Could you talk a little bit about first Dr. Ewell's accusation is probably a strong word. Dr. Ewell's inquiry as to why he wasn't invited to participate, but then also what was the controversy that you had to endure at the University of North Texas? And I know there's a lot there, but you can take that in whatever order you want.
Okay. Well, um, first of all, there was no opportunity at the talk itself to ask questions or push back against Ewell's accusations. I mean, the society was not afforded the opportunity for no. There were no questions. There was no Q&A. He stated his opinions as if they were the policy of the society, and there was no opportunity for any kind of Q&A or questioning or any kind of response at the time. So that also set up a feeling, I would say, in a lot of people that a strong response was needed. Um, and we issued a call for responses through the society. We didn't um, specify that they should be anti or pro Ewell. And Ewell himself received a copy of the invitation. So strictly speaking, he was afforded. If he had wanted to, he could have contributed. But I think what he wanted us to do, but what we didn't do was we didn't send him the responses and then ask him to respond to the responses. But and it didn't seem like practical to ask somebody to respond to themselves, right? He'd given this very contentious talk, and we asked people to respond to the talk, which they did, and a number of his friends responded on their side. We didn't put any limitation on anybody, responding, as long as they were qualified, and all of them were. All of the people that were qualified who responded, we published them. Even though we didn't agree with them, or I didn't agree with them, uh, certainly I made every effort to make sure that they got published, and that their work was solid, and I corrected all the grammar and all of that, and made sure that the footnotes worked and everything. So there was no censorship of pro-Ewell voices, if you will. There was no censorship of anti-Ewell voices either. It was like Socrates, as you might say, right? It was a Socratic symposium. And in fact, I chose the title symposium based on Plato's Symposium, where it's a dialogue and people present different views, in that case of the meaning of love. And in this case, it was a symposium about Ewell's talk. And we invited people to weigh in. And we didn't, as I said, we didn't invite Ewell to talk about himself or respond to himself. We did send him an invitation to contribute, but we had nothing against him contributing in the future once the symposium was published. In other words, it's very common when some kind of criticism is published of one scholar or another, that they get an opportunity after the critique has been published, they can respond. And nobody at any time said that Ewell had no right to respond and that we would not, publish a response to their responses, right? But
Forgive me for interrupting.
yeah,
And I apologize. This is going to be blunt, and whenever I do these interviews, I always put on the cap of people who might be against of what you're saying, and try and
okay,
voice
sure.
that objection. Was Dr. Philip Ewell not invited to the symposium because he was black?
No, his blackness had nothing to do with that whatsoever.
Did his forgive me, and I
Sure.
I cringe at even how I'm phrasing this, but this is
Right.
how people I think would respond. Did his blackness affect any of the responses? Did the fact that he was not only a music scholar but a race scholar influence a black race scholar influence the responses that he received for his work?
Well, I can only say that I don't see it. I don't see it like that.
Recently, Kanye West, now known as Ye, released a song titled Heil Hitler, which is, some people have said it's ironic, some people have said it's a ploy to garner attention. In any case, it is omitting, or I should say, not omitting, but incorporating the imagery and language that was used by the Nazis. There's a Heil Hitler anthem that constantly goes throughout the song. And what I think a lot of people are going to be perhaps unaware of is that this sort of black anti-Semitism has a longer history than just the last few years with this upsurge in America. And I was wondering if you could talk about some of the history of this very controversial topic.
So it's very important to understand that it goes well back into the 1930s. And in America, there was a small but nevertheless influential group of black agitators who were called the Black Führers, who were active in Harlem in the 1930s. They espoused a very harsh anti-Semitism that they shared with the Ku Klux Klan. And they actually collaborated with the Klan on the basis of this shared, really, truly virulent hatred of Jews. And so, as I said, they were called the Black Führers in because they admired Hitler. Now, after World War II, this element did not cease to exist, and it became associated with certain forms of black nationalism and what was called Afrocentrism in America, and especially in American academe. So there was a professor at CUNY by the name of Leonard Jeffries, who's actually the uncle of Hakeem Jeffries, who is now the minority leader in Congress, right? The Democratic minority leader. And Leonard Jeffries was a very virulent anti-Semite. And at the same time, he was a professor in the Africana Studies department at CUNY, and including at, I believe, Hunter as well. And so people at CUNY tolerated Leonard Jeffries and nurtured him, even though they knew that he was associated with the really terrible views of Jews. So one of the things that Jeffries and his colleagues at other places argued was that Jews had played a disproportionate role in the enslavement of blacks. And this was a thesis that they promulgated along with other figures, let's say the Nation of Islam. And Farrakhan was also busy promulgating this theory that Jews had been the prime motivators for the enslavement of blacks. And so Jews were especially guilty of the mistreatment of blacks in American history, the enslavement and transportation across the Atlantic, where many blacks died. And this accusation spread across American academia and was promulgated by various black nationalists and also black Muslims, certain sects of them. And this has never gone away. I mean, this is still with us today, this argument that Jews were responsible for this. And it also was given academic imprimatur, not only at CUNY, but at other schools like Wellesley College. And there's a book that Ewell actually cites in his book, negatively, I should say, critically. And it's called History Lesson, A Race Odyssey by Mary Lefkowitz, who was a professor at Wellesley College. And this controversy that erupted at Wellesley reminds me a lot of my controversy, the Schenker controversy that happened in 2020, which in a certain way, it shows the kind of recurrence of this controversy from the 1980s, okay? And one of the things that these Afrocentrists argued, another thing was that that the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, who were, let's say, the founders of Western civilization in many regards, or certainly co-founders along with the Judeo-Christian tradition, that they had stolen their philosophy and their great contribution to Western civilization from the blacks in Africa. So there was a book called Out of Africa, which was actually written by a non-black scholar, but was taken up by various black nationalists like Tony Curtis and so forth, who was a professor there at Wellesley, and was pushed as showing that Western civilization really was an invention of the blacks and of the Egyptians, and that the Greeks had stolen all of their culture from the blacks. Okay, and Mary Lefkowitz and other, let's say, mainstream, if we can use that word, classicists, classical scholars said that this is a bunch of nonsense, that this is pure myth making, and that none of the historical evidence supports this theory, or this hypothesis, really. And so she was accused, just like I was, of racism for saying that Western culture doesn't come from Black culture in Africa. So you can see that this almost these issues came up in the past. Now, one of the other issues that I raised in my offending article was the problem of anti-Semitism and misogyny in rap music. And rap music has as its sources, it has its roots in a sense of injustice and persecution in the Black ghettos of the inner city. I mean, that's where its birthplace is widely regarded to have been, and I think correctly. And the problem here is that in that culture, if you want to use that word, there is, in fact, a deep-rooted anti-Semitism and misogyny. And this has come to the fore again and again. And recently, I think that this Heil Hitler song is also rooted in the same soil, if you will, of Black anti-Semitism. And it comes at a time, you see, you can't look at these things in isolation. You can't just see them as artistic statements divorced from context, right? Every art form, every artistic statement, every painting, every piece of music, I agree, occurs in a historical context. And right now we're in a situation where the Jewish people are under assault worldwide, not just in Israel by Hamas, but worldwide. And this Heil Hitler song by Kanye West comes in that context. So one could argue that the Jews are already fighting for their very existence in a certain sense, their legitimacy and their ethos, their spirit, their Zionistic pride, their religion, their culture. And this comes in the culture, in the context of them being on the defensive. And the way I see it, it's like kicking somebody when they're down. In other words, the Jews are down right now. The diaspora community is certainly down. And what Kanye is doing is kicking them when they're down. I also don't like the fact that he, at the end of the song, and I have watched the video, by the way, at the end of the song, he has a recording of Hitler speaking and saying to people, "Look at all the good things that I've done for you. You should vote for me. You should be behind me." Um, this is very troubling because what it does is ignore all the terrible things that Hitler also did. The terrible assault on the Jews and anti-Semitism that he fostered, even before implementing the Holocaust. Like he worked so hard to create the conditions for the Holocaust to occur, and that really troubles me that West would actually quote Hitler speaking in his own voice.
Would you mind talking a little bit about John Heinrich Clarke and his connections to Hunter's College?
Okay, it's actually Hendrik Clarke.
Hendrik.
Okay. um,
Sorry.
with a K. Uh,
Yes.
he was, I think, fond of Ibsen, the playwright. Um,
Sorry,
so
we were talking about Heinrich Schenker, and I just had that
yeah,
memory.
yeah.
Yeah,
No,
I'll get
it's
things for that
Clarke,
later.
and it's Clarke with an E. John Henrik Clarke with an E.
Yes.
So he was a professor at Hunter College, and he and Jeffries were close friends and associates, both professors at CUNY, and they were both associated with Afrocentrism. Um, and I'd like to read a little bit just about Clarke here. Um, so Clarke claimed that there was not and has never been, quote, an historical alliance between blacks and Jews, end quote. From the very beginning, the Jews had always betrayed the African peoples who befriended them, and it's important to note that for Clarke, the beast was bicephalous. That means it had two heads. White America joined with Zionist Jews, together bent on strangling the people of color in the United States, Africa, and the Middle East. The Jews, according to these nationalists, had perfected the, quote, modern evil of neocolonialism. Now we're talking already here. We're back in the 1970s and 1980s, if you can believe it. This is long before today, right? And they're already talking about the Jews as having perfected the modern evil of neocolonialism, now conspired with the US government to deploy Zionist dollarism to subjugate them. This time, the satanic Jews were not driven to overthrow Christianity, to destroy the Aryan race, or even to undermine Islam and poison its prophet, but to colonize all people of color. So we have here also a quote from Dr. Clarke at Wayne County Community College in 1989. Quote, African people have been manipulated into agreeing with everything white, from a white Jesus to white bread. And now we get to the very important quote. And here I want to read the whole quote because, unlike Ewell, I think you have to look at the whole quote. Okay? A mere handful of people utilized the word Holocaust, this is the quote, and made the entire world weep for them, making black people forget that it was the same handful who participated in the African Holocaust. What he means here is African slavery. And he again continued saying that the evil genius of Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, and Albert Einstein has colonized the minds of the world. And he asked why this minute group of people, namely the Jews, were so effective. Now, Jeffries ignores the reality of discrimination against Jews in Europe and recasts them as the devilish power behind those very same forces that were targeting the Jews. And what I also find very, very interesting here is that if you look at the CUNY website, Communications Press Room News honoring the legacy of Dr. John Hendrik Clarke, you won't find any mention of all of this on the CUNY website. In other words, it's a kind of sanitization of Clarke, which reminds me very much of what the Germans have done with Nazis, ex-Nazis. It's called a Persilschein. A Persilschein Persil is a form of cleaning detergent, laundry detergent, okay? So the idea is that after the war, the ex-Nazis were put into a washing machine with Persil and they were sanitized. And the same thing has happened with Hendrik Clarke and with Leonard Jeffries, both of whom were very influential Afrocentrists and Black nationalists at CUNY. Now, I didn't, in my original essay, I didn't mention this history. Maybe I should have, but I do indeed believe that it's the soil in which Ewell's argument has been nurtured. And it's why he may not even know about all of this, but it's the soil in which these ideas, these types of ideas flourish. Let's put it that way.
Hmm.
So there's a long, in other words, it's not a new thing. None of this is new. It has a long history. I could mention something else that we need to think about the white anti-Semitism that accompanied this too. I mean, you can't just point a finger at the Black community and say that they are the culprits. No, there was a lot of white anti-Semitism. If you think about Henry Ford, he was based in Michigan, and he disseminated terrible anti-Semitism. He in his journal, in his newspaper, I think it was called the Dearborn Independent, but I can't remember for sure. He published an English translation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and this was handed out at all of the Ford dealerships in the 30s and so forth. Hitler was a big fan of Henry Ford. He had a picture of Ford up in his office in the 30s in Munich, I believe. And there was a symbiosis between Black and white anti-Semitism. And so this all goes back. It's not a new thing.
Do you mind if I ask you why why the Jews? Why the hatred? I mean, obviously there's this far right strain of suspicion
Mm.
towards Israel and towards Jews, and the the articulation for that goes something like, well, the Jews claim to be oppressed and they're in all the highest positions of power, like bankers is the stereotype, or Hollywood, or in the music industry. That was Kanye's big rant that he did a few years ago. Oh, it's the Jews in my industry that are keeping me down, and this is why I hate them. And why why pick the Jews of all people? Where does this hatred come from? And I know that's a broad question,
Mm.
and the answer obviously I know deviates from group to group. Like if you're an Islamist, as an example, well, the Jews are the infidel. Things like this. Obviously, that there's differentiations that can be made, but broadly speaking, why all the hatred?
Well, the anti-Semites would say that it's the Jews' fault that they're hated, right? That there's something intrinsic in Jews that makes them hated, right? Um, I would say that the answers are multiple. It's like I would say that anti-Semitism is like a cancer that, and like cancer, we don't know whether there's just one single cause, right? That there are multiple causes. There are probably multiple diseases that we call cancer because they have certain similarities, but they're actually rather different diseases, right? So, um, anti-Semitism again has such a long history, and it mutates and morphs over time. So if you look at the ancient world, um, the the Jews were hated by the early Christians, believe it or not, because they didn't agree that the Messiah had come. Um, And there are scholars who argue that, for example, Judas in the New Testament was a later invention. He doesn't appear in Paul's writings at all, because he wasn't actually real, but he was invented. The Jewish traitor, let's put it this way, Judas, was invented in order to disassociate early Christianity from its source, from Judaism itself, right? And to create, to foster and leverage anti-Semitism to help the spread of early Christianity. And once you have Christianity, you have a strangely paradoxical situation vis-a-vis Christianity and Judaism. On the one hand, Christians have never been able to disassociate Jews from Christianity, and Jesus and all the main protagonists in the story of Jesus are Jewish. And Jesus was, in my opinion, one of our truly great rabbis. So anyway, there's a Jewish Christian conflict that also is in history and forms a background to what's called anti-Judaism. It's not necessarily anti-Semitism, but it's anti-Judaism. And if you look in the Middle Ages, you'll see that Jews are very often portrayed as being blind, because they haven't seen the truth that Jesus was the Messiah. So the church is represented as a young woman who sees the truth of Jesus's role as the Messiah, and the synagogue is represented as blindfolded because she doesn't see. She refuses to see that the Messiah has come. Okay. So this dichotomy is there in Christianity, and it's also there in Islam, by the way, where certain Jewish figures are actually regarded as prophets within Islam and treated with great respect, like Moses, for example, is regarded as a hero in Islam. But at the same time, because the Jews in Muhammad's world did not want to acknowledge his role, but wanted to stick with their own religion and their own tradition, they too were demonized by Muhammad and his followers. So in Islam, there is also an anti-Judaism that's put, that's very deeply rooted in that tradition. And what you have in the West is Jews forced to wear the yellow star and certain clothing, so they would be clearly identified. They were expelled from one country after another when the rulers decided that they'd had enough of the Jewish communities in their midst. And the same thing happened in the same kind of treatment in the Islamic world. So Jews were given what was called dhimmi status. So they were secondary citizens. For example, they couldn't ride horses they couldn't ride horses like the Muslims could, but they were restricted to riding donkeys. They had to behave like second-class citizens. So this anti-Judaism pervades both cultures, both the Christian and the Islamic cultures, in which Jews were always the oppressed, actually, for real, not phony oppression, but real oppression. And then in the later 19th century, you get a new kind of anti-Semitism, which I would call scientific anti-Semitism, where scientists determined that Jews and blacks were biologically inferior to whites. And this kind of biological anti-Semitism is something, by the way, that Schenker absolutely rejected. Um, he couldn't countenance that. Um, anyway, I don't have a single answer to this, but one thing I think everybody in the world today has to recognize is that there was only one Holocaust. There was only one genocide. And when I use the word genocide, I use it in the way that it was intended to be used. It was invented by a Polish Jewish lawyer in 1944 to describe the government sanctioned, government ordered, industrial scale murder of a particular people, namely the Jewish people in Europe, the industrial murder of 6 million people, okay, men, women, and children, entirely because on the scientific, so-called scientific racist basis that they were ethnically Jewish. Okay, and that's what the word genocide means. And the Holocaust has essentially is the most egregious and the most terrifying manifestation of genocide that the world has ever seen. I think that there's been since then, there have been uh, situations where groups of people um, were murdered, large groups of people, especially the Armenians before the actual genocide of the Jews in World War II. The Armenians were attacked in this way during World War I and shortly after. So there was an Armenian genocide. And there have been similar situations in Africa. We know that. But we have to be careful in using that word genocide. And I think it's an abuse of the word and a cheapening of the word if you don't understand that and recognize that genocide is it should be used very carefully where we have a state actor who is determined that a certain ethnic group needs to be systematically, and I think that's the key word here, systematically eliminated. And the means are an industrial type of murder machine. That's what we mean by genocide. And the
Yeah,
Jews, I'm afraid, are defined by that.
mm. And to your point, for anybody listening who, I've seen a lot of Holocaust skepticism, a lot of Holocaust denial recently. Um, the fascinating thing, and I mean fascinating in the obviously the coldest way, but fascinating thing about the Holocaust is that the reason we have such accurate numbers is because the Germans were very systematic in the way that they
Mhm.
committed this genocide. They kept records. We have it from the horse's mouth, if you will.
Yes.
Uh, I
By the
do
way,
want
could I add
to.
one
Yes.
thing here as a horse too? That, and I talked about this, but my family personally lost a good half of most of my family on my mother's side was murdered in the Holocaust. So, I mean, that's immediate. I mean, that was 15 years before I was born. Okay. So that's not distant. That's still fresh in my memory, even though my parents have passed away. I remember not only my parents, but my relatives who spoke about their experiences during the Holocaust. This is not ancient memory. This is people whose lives and mine overlapped.
Before moving on to our next subject, I do want to ask you about the quotation that Dr. Ewell has used to make his argument about Schenker's racism and anti-Semitism. One of the things that you've pointed out is that there's actually not only missing sentences but missing context in what Dr. Ewell has presented. I didn't know if you wanted to go
Mm.
into a little bit more of that.
Yes, absolutely, because it's very important. Now, um, you have to understand that there's another phenomenon at play here. And this is the phenomenon of what's been called Jewish self-hatred. So because Jews have been persecuted for centuries, right? There have always been Jews who dealt with this persecution in different ways, right? And some Jewish people internalized this kind of hatred towards Jews and anti-Judaism by hating themselves. And sometimes Jews converted to Christianity, and they leveraged their knowledge of Judaism from the inside to support the anti-Judaism of the Christian culture as a whole, by persecuting their fellow or former fellow Jews using this specialized knowledge that they had. This goes back to the 16th century, if not earlier. So there were various converts to Christianity from Judaism who, you might say, manifested this kind of self-hatred by attacking their former co-religionists, using their knowledge, their inside knowledge of Jewish learning, Jewish education, the Torah, the Talmud, the commentaries, all of that. They referenced those, and they had expertise in reading Hebrew and reading Aramaic, which a lot of Christians could not do. And they used that knowledge against their former co-religionists and against themselves in a certain sense, right? In order to be better accepted. So there are scholars who have documented this, and one of the important books that I've read is a book by Sander Gilman called Jewish Self-Hatred: Antisemitism and the Hidden Language of the Jews. And he traces this back into the Reformation, the period of the Reformation. And so the period of Martin Luther and other German Protestant and Catholic theologians who collaborated with Jewish converts to attack the Jews. And thereby, let's say, leveraging their self-hatred to make a case against the Jews. Now, in his latest book, and also in his writings and those of some of his followers, Ewell accused me of anti-Semitism. So, and he also accused Schenker of anti-Semitism. And what he says about Schenker, I find especially important and interesting, because the way that he goes about it is by quoting a diary entry by Schenker from 1915 about the Jews from the East, in other words, from Galicia, which was called the Pale of Settlement. I should mention that the Pale of Settlement was the part of Eastern Europe where Jews were allowed to settle. There were large parts of Europe where Jews were just forbidden to settle. And so a lot of the Jews were crowded into the poor part of Eastern Europe called Galicia. And there they lived either mostly in small little towns called shtetls, or little cities, little towns, or if they had special permission, they were allowed to live in some of the larger cities. Most Jews were actually living in these small cities, small towns called shtetls. And in fact, that's where Schenker grew up. That's where he was born. His father was the town doctor. So Schenker came from Eastern Europe. He came from Galicia. So he was actually one of the Jews, the Eastern European Jews, that Ewell would like us to believe is being criticized by Schenker in this statement in 1915. So I'd like to read what the quotation that Ewell is drawing from here, from Schenker's diary. But the problem is that Ewell leaves out an important sentence, okay, which is in the middle of the entry. So obviously Ewell must have read it, but he omits it because I think, as in other cases, it doesn't support what he's trying to say. In fact, it contradicts it very clearly. So it's a really an unethical abuse of quotation, which is not scholarly. But let me read it here. It says, this is from September 29th, 1915, and it's during World War I. So that's also important to understand, because Schenker uses an analogy between these poor Jews and soldiers on the battlefield, right? So he's thinking about the war as well. So the Galician Jews, these are the poor Eastern European Jews. Schenker writes, they are criticized for having such difficulty in linking up with other nations or assimilating themselves to them. And one attributes to them with some anxiety manners and gestures that they continue to retain after they have come into contact with better circles of people. Now, this is very interesting. The next sentence, but I think that the racial question plays the smallest role in their isolation. For me, the one and only cause for all of this is their boundless poverty. So Schenker is saying that it's not a racial thing that they're not assimilating to higher level culture, quote unquote, but that because they're very poor. And now we get a sentence that Ewell omits. So Schenker continues, anyone who lives like them from hand to mouth under the most difficult of conditions, hated, despised, and ostracized, pursued, burdened usually with a large family, and underestimated in what they do best, i.e. in their Jewish education, that's what I add here, will find no disposition to assimilate given their shattered existence. Now, also, it's important to point out that we need to read what Schenker actually wrote in German, because the English translation given in the online Schenker documents project is not quite accurate here. So Schenker says, given their shattered existence, they can find no disposition to assimilate. And then he continues, they are like soldiers on the battlefield, filled with concerns for their life and in a constant state of warfare. But one should instruct the fighting soldier on the battlefield to adopt and exercise the good manners of a man who is wealthy and enjoys the full security of the moment. Schenker means that, ironically, they simply cannot recover their breath, and for that reason cannot be thinking at all of good manners. So, in other words, Schenker is very sympathetic to these poor Jews who lack, let's say, a high culture. He's not anti-Semitic at all. He's very sympathetic to them. It's the opposite of what Ewell is claiming. And I think that he's done a Schenkerian analysis and historical truth a huge disfavor by engaging in this false narrative about Schenker being an anti-Semite. And there are other clear indications, unequivocal indications in Schenker's diary and also in his letters that he was a very proud and believing Jew. Now, some people have argued, well, because Schenker wasn't an Orthodox Jew, he wasn't a believing Jew. But that's a false that's not a correct observation, because just because Jews don't necessarily observe all the mitzvot or the commandments, the 613 of them, that Orthodox Jews feel are essential for Jewish identity, does not mean that they are not spiritually Jewish and that they don't follow the basic tenets of Judaism. That is a grave injustice to the majority of Jews, both living and dead. And I would go further. There's documentary evidence throughout Schenker's writings that he believed that God not only exists, but that the laws of music that God has created, that he as a Jew had a special role in promulgating and explaining those laws. So he saw himself as a kind of Moses of music theory. And that's really essential to understanding Schenker's whole ideology and message. And that's something that has not been fully understood even today. Now, one might wonder, well, why did Schenker write a 4,000 or 5,000 page, depending on how you count, diary? And Schenker himself, he says why. He says that Jews have always been misrepresented and have always been persecuted, and that he has wanted to document all of his services to mankind through his diary, so that he would not be later misrepresented. That was the underlying motivation for the diary, which is, I think, extremely revealing about who Schenker was and how he saw himself.